Hey guys, good morning once again and welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. My name is Dan Derry and I'm the president of the Institute of Fulfilled Eschatology. So today we're going to take a one video break from our Matthew chapter 24 study, and I would like to share in this video a few thoughts from 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 10. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because a friend of mine brought this text up, and he believes this is definitive proof that, the judgment is in our future. The Lord hasn't returned. Covenant eschatology or fulfilled eschatology must be false, because this scripture to him is proof that the judgment is at the end of time. Okay, now let me read the text. 2 Corinthians 5:10. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad. And like I said, my friend puts this in our future because he's like, look, this is the judgment of all. He says we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. How's that happen? This is, I haven't appeared, he said. Have you appeared? So he takes this to mean a judgment of all men at the end of time before Christ. Now, what I want to say about this text is notice these key elements or these key features of this text. It is the judgment of Christ, number one. Number two, it's the judgment of all men. Paul says we must all appear, okay? Judgment of Christ, judgment of all men. And he says that we may be recompensed for the deeds done in the body. So it's a judgment of reward according to their works. Okay? It's a judgment of Christ, it's the judgment of all men, and it's the judgment of works leading to reward or not. Now, go with me, and I want to show you guys a parallel text, a parallel judgment text, which definitively places 2 Corinthians 5:10 in our past, not in our future. Go with me to Matthew chapter 16, guys. And 16 verse 27. Watch this. For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then will repay every man according to his deeds. Now listen, watch this again. Look at this. Look at the elements. This is the judgment of the Son of Man. That's the judgment of Christ. It's the judgment of every man. He says he will repay every man according to their deeds. And like I just said, it's the judgment of works. Every man according to their works, okay? So we have these same elements of judgment in these two texts. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10, it's the judgment of Christ. Matthew 16:27, it's the judgment of the Son of Man. 2 Corinthians 5:10, it's the judgment of all. All must stand before the judgment seat. Matthew 16:27, it's the judgment of all men. Are you with me? 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10 is to reward them according to their deeds done in the body. Matthew 16:27 is to repay them according to their works or their deeds. Guys, same texts, parallel texts, okay? Same judgment. Look at what Jesus says in verse 28 of Matthew 16. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. This is the coming of the Son of Man in verse 27 to reward every man according to their works. Guys, Jesus places that judgment in the lifetime of his first century disciples. Now follow me. Since Jesus placed the judgment of Matthew 27, which was his judgment to reward every man according to their works in the first century, in the lifetime of his disciples, and since Matthew 16:27 and 28 is the judgment of 2 Corinthians 5:10. That means the judgment of 2 Corinthians 5:10, which is the judgment of Christ to reward every man according to the deeds done in the body, their works, must have taken place within the lifetime of the first century disciples. Guys, there's no getting around it. They are parallel texts of the same judgment, and Jesus placed that judgment within the lifetime of his disciples. Point number two, guys. My friend completely misses the historical context and the historical framework of what was taking place in the first century. Notice, he places 2 Corinthians 5:10 in our future as a judgment at the end of time. Okay? And he assumes that every man has had to live and died in order to face this judgment. It's the judgment of all men. There can be no other men being judged after this, according to him. Notice, he forgets that in Genesis, in the account of the flood, the world was judged. This was the judgment of all flesh. The Lord said, the end of all flesh has come before me. I will destroy all flesh from the face of the earth. But guys, were you and I there? Were we born? Was Paul even born? No. It's the judgment of the world. And someone might say, my friend would probably say to that, well, no, that was the judgment of that world. That world was judged. To which I would say, exactly. That's the point, guys. What was taking place in the first century was the judgment of the world. The old covenant world, guys. It was another judgment of another world. Peter makes this clear in 2 Peter chapter 3, which I won't get into. I only want to make a few brief comments about this, guys. But notice, all the language of judgment and of the end of the world in the New Testament, how can't we see that what Paul was speaking about in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 10 was the judgment of a world that was ending? Notice Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 26 and following, he says, the time has been shortened. And he says, there is a present distress upon us. And he says, if you're married, don't divorce. If you're divorced, don't marry. Because he says, the form of this world is passing away in verse 31. Are you with me, guys? John, in 1 John chapter 2 and 15, he says, love not the world, for all the things of the world, the love of the world is not of the Father, but is of the world. He says, and the world is passing away and the lusts of it. Guys, what world was passing away? Guys, the old covenant world was passing away. And the next verse is, John says, little children, it is the last hour. Last hour of the old covenant creation, the old world. Peter is using Genesis imagery of another end of all flesh. The end of the old covenant world was upon them. Are you with me, guys? Peter would say in 1 Peter 4:7, the end of all things is at hand. See, what my friend completely dismisses in his theology is that there was an ending of an age. Jesus said the end of the age would be in his generation. And the ending of that age was the old covenant world, the old covenant creation that could never bring righteousness to man, could never bring man back to fellowship with Jehovah. And that age was ending, which would give way and establish the age of the kingdom, the new world, guys. Jesus' new creation. And guys, just like the world was judged in Noah's day at the end of that world, the typological end, of course, all men would be judged according to their works at the end of the old covenant world in AD 70. This is Paul's point, guys. He's not talking about a judgment at the end of time where all men stand together. He's talking about the judgment of a creation, of a world, of an old system, and everybody under that system would give an account. Are you with me, guys? And listen, I've already shown you that judgment took place in the lifetime of Jesus' disciples. Matthew 16, 27, 28 is a parallel judgment to 2 Corinthians 5, 10. And Jesus placed it in the first century. And guys, the first century, and at the destruction of Jerusalem and the annihilation of that old covenant system of Judaism was the end of the world. It was the end of the old covenant world, and every man in that world, under that system and under that age, faced judgment, some to everlasting life and some to everlasting condemnation. So guys, I hope that helps. Hope that puts that in a context where we can understand the fulfillment of all things in Jesus Christ. And we'll pick this up again next time on Answers on Eschatology, and we'll be back to our Matthew chapter 24 study. God bless, guys. Bye for now.